So I wanted to come to you today because I do see an issue in our economy that still stimulates from the lack of unity that we have. But I want to start looking at some root causes, because too often we're masking issues and we're trying to solve problems, but we're not hitting the root cause. So when I look at the divisions that we have, a lot of the divisions that I've realized in our economy, from religion to politics, it stimulates from our values and our principles. So our values and our principles, I found, are contradicting each other. And so what happens in an economy is you have to, any business even, you have to build a business on principles, foundational principles, that this is what we stand on, because foundational principles are what's solid. They don't move, they don't change. The difference between values and foundational principles are values are changing. So you can change your values over time, but your foundational principles should remain the same. So when we established this country, when God established this country, it was established using a constitution. So our constitution we pulled our foundational principles out of our constitution. The issue with the constitution is it was man-made. So when you have a man-made constitution, that means your principles are going to waver, because the interpretation of the law is going to waver. The interpretation of the bill is going to waver. The interpretation of your constitution is going to waver. Over time, the way I perceive it is going to change. So that's why then we have to turn around and we have to mend it, which lets you know that it's not stabilized, because it has to change over time according to the times and the perceptions. But we do have something in this world that is stabilized, that I don't care what period, what time it is stabilized. And that's what we have to build on. We have to build on principles that are stabilized, that does not change over time, because that is the only way you can build a sustainable economy. And that principle are principles of Christ. We are a Christian country for a purpose. We are a Christian country because God, through Christ, and the founding fathers who were Christians had established this country. Therefore, they anticipated that our principles would not be solely rooted in the Constitution, understanding that imperfect man will never create a perfect law. If the Bible said laws made nothing perfect, of course the Constitution would make nothing perfect. But along with Christ's principles, we can have principles that are stabilized. And so now what happens in our country, as we're going to rebuild, we can rebuild on the principles of Christ. Principles like freedom of speech and freedom of choice. And you say, how is that a freedom of choice? How is that a God's principle? We see freedom of choice in the Bible all day. That's a godly principle. God gave us the freedom of choice from the very beginning. He said, choose life or death. In the Garden of Eden, he turned around and even put a tree of life and a tree of good and the knowledge of good and evil. And then let them know that this tree will separate you from me and you will die. But yet I gave you the choice to choose it, regardless of the fact that I am pro-life. I gave you the choice to choose it. So that brings me to the issues that we see when we're conflicted in our economy with issues like abortion. We're conflicted because we're looking at values versus principles. So a principle of this country and a principle of God is freedom of choice. You have the freedom to choose to live however you want to live. If you want to choose death, choose death. If you want to choose life, choose life. But I hope that you choose life. So the freedom of choice is foundational. Remember, we said foundational does not change. So if you have a value that contradicts the foundation, then your value has to submit to the foundation, lest your foundation begin to waver with everything that comes its way, every perception, because values are always going to change, and people do not always have the same values. From country to country, from class to class, from race to race, from gender to gender, we all have different values. From family to family, the values are always going to change. But the one thing that in our country has to remain the same is our principles. Our principles, if we're going to build a country, We have to build it on the stabilized principles of Christ. So that regardless of whatever circumstances and crises and challenges and issues come our way, we do not divert from the principle of the freedom to choose. So when you have issues like abortion, and then you say, okay, well, you have the Republicans and conservatives that says, well, we're pro-life. And I get it. We're pro-life. But if your pro-life value, which can change, if your pro-life value contradicts the foundational principle of the country, then your pro-life value has to submit to the principle. So yes, you're pro-life. I get it. God was pro-life and gave us the tree of life, but he was also pro-choice by giving us a choice to choose for our own selves and our own bodies. So it makes it easier for us to discern and say, as a country, what decisions should we be making regarding various issues when we have principles. But when you have a country with no principles, then you see the morals and the values that just continuously decline, and the value of life just continues to diminish. Why? Because we have no principles to stand on. So everybody's living on their own values according to their own understanding of what they think is right, which diminishes over time in an economy. What looks right is not always right because the economy is continuously diminishing in morals and values. So what was right 10 years ago might not be right today because our economy moral values are diminishing. So how do we offset that? By standing on principles of Christ, by building a country that stands on principles of Christ. And it allows us to remove much of the division, much of the arguments, much of the debates. Because when I have a principle, I can make sure that if the laws contradict the principle, then that law has to submit to the principle. So yes, I believe in pro-choice or pro-life, whichever you believe. You may believe in pro-choice for abortion. And you may believe in pro-life for abortion. But if it contradicts one or the other, it has to submit to the foundational principle. So I see all sides and I see everybody's perspective when it comes to building a country. But at the end of the day, the only thing that's sustainable, that is rooted in a self-sustainable life force, is the principles of Christ. And if we're not building a country on the principles of Christ, then it will not stand, nor will it sustain for the future of our children. So before you, once again, I put before you a choice. We have to choose life, to choose a system that's built on principles that can sustain mankind. So that's the choice that we're faced with today. When it comes to all the issues that we have to choose life. We have to be pro-choice, and we have to understand what does God or what does Christ stand for? What does Christ stand on? When it comes to any issue, what does he stand on? So that you can understand what you stand on. If we're going to truly be a Christian country, then we need to stand up to the responsibility of being a Christian country and standing on the principles of Christ. Because if we don't, our future is very bleak. If we don't, our children's future will be very bleak. So we have to choose now, today, to make that choice while we're right in the middle of the chaos of change. Is the best time to find the sustainability of Christ and those principles so that we can stand on and catapult out of this situation. So I thank you, and I hope that you stand with me so that as a country, as a nation, we can stand together and build on the principles of Christ. Thank you.